right, thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Absolute privilege to be here. Thank you so much, LongHash, for this opportunity. There's a fantastically curated audience out here. For those of you staying for the sessions today and tomorrow, this is an excellent lineup, to say the least. My name is Vinay Mohan. I want to talk to you about something quite contentious today. I've been asked to present on the idea of whether blockchain is really needed. I've been told I have to cut through the buzz. So depending on how you see this, depending on where you are in your journey, this is either going to cut through the buzz or it's going to be an absolute buzzkill. So here we are. It's the 6th of June, 2019, nearly a decade, more than a decade after Bitcoin was first thrown onto the international stage. Do you really need a blockchain? Or do you really need blockchain? The answer is probably not. And by the way, this is my promise to you. I'm going to be completely honest, objective. I've been in this space for the last 3 years. I will try and be as non-partisan as possible and as non-commercial as possible. But this is not a sales pitch. My sales pitch would be exactly the opposite. You do need a blockchain. But today, you don't need a blockchain is where I want to start with. I take the position that if you're asking yourself, do I need a blockchain? The answer is probably not. Probably not because of 2 reasons. Firstly, and many of you know this, we are still at very early days as far as the tech is concerned. There's lots of things that are in development. There are lots of issues that need to be overcome. I say this quite frequently, as have a number of other people. If you equate blockchain to the days of the internet, we're probably still in the mid-90s. This as a paradigm is yet to evolve. Also, there are nuances to consider. I think the answer is not so straightforward, nor should the question be, do I need blockchain? For example, if you were to ask me if you need blockchain, I would have to look at 2 things. First of all, who are you? And more specifically, what exactly is your need? After all, technology is a means to a wider end. If you are doing something, do it for the purpose of a greater need. If your business does not require a certain feature, then why do it at all? Right? So the answer lies in looking at nuances. And over the next 20 minutes or so, that's what I'd like to walk you through. Starting with something that I like to call first principles. Now, I want to pause here and tell you that over the next 48 hours, you're going to hear from a number of different experts. Many of them will tell you about the platforms that they represent. Many of them will talk about use cases. I hate to disappoint, but I will not be going into use cases in detail. Firstly, I think there's a time for that. There's a time and a way of approaching use cases. But I would like to focus on what I like to call first principles because it's important to understand why we've come to where we are with blockchain. So I want to take you back in time a little bit and talk about something which is not particularly exciting, but I think is extremely important. So let's talk about trust, the glorious T word. And you all heard Don Tapscott a while ago, and Don has this excellent definition that I want to paraphrase. He defines trust as the implicit agreement that the other party will deliver on its promise. I trust you because I know that you will deliver and you will be accountable, you will be transparent, and you will do what you promise to do. And trust is an extremely important word because if you think about the history of blockchain, Satoshi Nakamoto, who first propounded the idea with Bitcoin, spoke about how there's been a trust failure, not just in financial services or not just in any one side of society, but at a planetary level, we have a severe trust deficit. So it's important to approach blockchain by talking about trust because as we all know, trust evolves, and trust has been the story of humanity for the last 2,000 years. And the problem that blockchain is trying to solve is very much a trust issue. So we've placed our trusts in varying entities and agencies across the last 2 millennia. People used to believe in all sorts of things. We used to believe in divinity or what we call God. Trust then moved on to the words of kings and queens. We started believing in books and written down constitutions. Governments started to emerge, society started to believe in republic administrations, international bodies, manage trust for us. And here we are today, where we're putting our trust in the hands of cloud service providers and corporations, banks, lawyers, attorneys. So trust is a very fundamental aspect. It's a fundamental construct that transcends the idea of blockchain or technology or use case or any of these things. And it's philosophical, it's a little far-fetched, but it's important we talk about it. And I'd like to talk to you a little bit about trust, because as trust evolves, we've discovered that all of us, we could be individuals, we could be institutions, we have consistently paid a high price for trust. There's always been trust in the hands of middlemen, and we end up paying a high price for trust. So the question of whether you need blockchain should really start about how are we addressing the trust construct. We attempted this about, well, close to 20 years ago with the launch of the internet. The internet was the idea of a small group of people who believed in open thinking and sharing and wanted to share scientific findings freely and seamlessly across the world. The internet was really that first attempt to try and make the world a shareable place where you didn't have to depend on too many intermediaries. And as beautiful as an attempt as it was, many people out there, including myself, I think, believe that the internet is somewhat broken, which is slightly unfair. Perhaps we should say the internet hasn't evolved as effectively as we would have liked it to have evolved. So, the internet presented the idea that we can all openly share with one another, but it stopped short of letting us agree with one another. So the premise of blockchain, at least in the enterprise sense, is where the internet stopped short, blockchain can help us agree or come to agreement with each other without the need for middlemen. One of the things that we saw happen with the internet is this evolution that we're going through, and none of this has anything to do with blockchain. This just is. It's a pattern that we can see all around us. We've moved with the advent of e-commerce. We've moved through the platform economy. We then discovered that not everyone has to own everything. We can start sharing assets. If I have a car, I can share it with other passengers through a drive share app. If I have a home, I can put it up on Airbnb. I can share that asset. And we're slowly starting to inch towards what is now being touted as the P2p economy. So the idea that trust has to be centralized and we have to go through central institutions or platforms has moved to more sharing-focused economy, and now with the advent of peer-to-peer computing and peer-to-peer business models, we're moving to more of a peer-to-peer economy. The question, though, is are we ready in terms of the base canvas? Do we have the right canvas to paint this picture on? I don't think so. I think the world that we've seen and left behind with the internet is not necessarily the most robust or the most effective one for us to write the rules for peer-to-peer. Why? Because overall, there's a movement that's coming towards us, and it's called decentralization. And decentralization for me is not lack of centralization. It is merely a reassignment of trust, and it's happening across the planet. It's not something that blockchain is moving. It's not something that's happening just because of technology. This is affecting pretty much everyone around the planet. We have been talking for a long time about banking the unbanked, right? That is in a way decentralization. The sharing of assets to make ownership of your daily rides and staying in Airbnbs is in a form decentralization. Young entrepreneurs and millennials especially are moving to more of a gig economy. The idea that you don't have to depend on one employer anymore, you don't need a middleman to make the labor market possible, is part of decentralization. So decentralization is something that I would like to put forward as a base consideration to talking about blockchain. Let's move to what I'd like to call the second wave here. So with the advent of decentralization, we're seeing how, you may be familiar with these two terms, we've seen how the internet, the age of the internet, which was largely a Web 2 age, it was Byzantine, it had a lot of adversarial differences, it was balkanized, not very clear, there were lots of silos that were built into it, and it was based on bespoke technology. And that is now shifting towards a Web 3 world, at the heart of which blockchain is powering a lot of the movement. So we're moving from a Web 2 world where we could share but not agree, and we still needed middlemen. What we ended up with was a lot of private institutions that monopolized and became very strong single points of failure in the world, putting all of their eggs in one basket and one fine day losing that basket. So I don't know how many of you have had your WhatsApp hacked. I think I may have been, or have been SIM swapped, or any of these problems that affect centralized constructs these days. But we are evolving, and this second wave is important to take into consideration. So before we ask ourselves, do we need blockchain? Let's start looking at the wider movements around us. And this is not happening because of blockchain. It's happening because humanity as a whole, on a planet-wide scale, is evolving. So we're moving to a Web 3 world, and Web 3 promises to be a little more sane, a lot more seamless and standard. We should have the ways and means to exchange and share with one another without having to depend on middlemen to whom we pay a very high price. For those of you who remember this article, back in 2015, The Economist spoke about how the underlying technology that powered Bitcoin, basically, the blockchain, could be repurposed and become the trust machine. And the promise was not to deliver truth, but the promise was to deliver trust, with the idea that fundamentally, if you have a peer-to-peer computing system that was cryptographically secure, with the idea that there would be not multiple silos of information, but one single source of truth. None of these, by the way, were new at the time. We all knew, so for the computer scientists in the room, peer-to-peer has existed long before Bitcoin, as has basic tenets of cryptographic security, as well as distributed computing. So none of this was foundationally new. But the promise of blockchain, which is a somewhat black swan event, if you like, because no one really saw it coming. It didn't evolve the same way robotics or machine learning evolved. It was exponential in its growth. The promise was, with these three basic tenets, you could do lots of interesting things. You could allow for immutable record keeping. You could stop thinking about computing limited to borders. It could become beyond borders now. Most importantly, at least Bitcoin proved this, you could solve the double spend problem comprehensively. Not 100%, but with 99.9% surety, you could solve the double spend problem. Very interestingly, gave rise to a whole new narrative of digital nativity. So the question was, if I have to trust you and pay money, ultimately, what do I own? Do I get to keep my data? Is that money in the bank truly mine? What is native to me? Yes, we converted lots of physical things and papers to electronic medium, but did that have digital nativity? So blockchain brought about the idea of tokens, which was providing a digitally native feature to assets that you own. So today we talk about tokenizing artwork and real estate and traditional capital market instruments, all with the idea that if you can prove that what you own can never be double spent, and if you can prove that what you own is on a secure distributed network like the blockchain is, then that is truly yours. That's the truest form of ownership that you can get today. And more than anything else, cheaper trust. So the price of trust, we hope, is going to plummet. And the fact that many of us have been paying too much for trust for too long is now going to change. So when you look at blockchain, when you look at the need for blockchain, all I'd say to you is please consider all of these aspects. There's lots of different features that go into deciding whether blockchain is essential or not. Because if you're not catering for any of these, if you're not looking at lowering the cost of trust for your customer base, or if you believe that a centralized construct is going to work really well for you, then my answer at the beginning, probably not, is what you have to go with. Also, along with this new construct of redefining trust came the idea that the enterprises of the future may not necessarily be the way we see them today. Today, the enterprise largely is a balkanized corporation. It depends, and its USP is to make sure that no one can get access to the data that it has. It has to monetize my data and yours, right? So that is radically poised to change. With Web3, we hope to see more cooperative economic models. So for those of you thinking about whether you need blockchain, the cues are right there. If you are thinking about a more cooperative system of working with adversaries, or if you're looking at multi-sided markets, so not just doing one thing, but seeing the confluence of two or three different use cases. And a very simple example I'd like to give is, in the platform world, or in the shared economy world, if you've used Uber, Uber had a network of drivers that it had to ferry passengers around. It used the same network to launch Uber Eats. So now you could use the same network, you could now have the confluence of more than one kind of service. So you can drop and pick up people, but you can also drop and pick up food. So it's a very simplistic way of saying it, but then we see the emergence of multi-sided marketplaces. And there's a few very good examples I can give you later. But most importantly, technology confluence. With the Web3 world, there's a lot of jargon with robotics and IoT and AI all coming together. I can't remember who it was. It was a Russian professor who said, we're not inventing blockchain for human beings, but it's a settlement layer for robots. Right, so maybe what we're building is for a whole new age. Maybe this is the settlement layer on top of which connected cars will talk to each other. But all in all, we're looking at a whole new definition of the word enterprise. So if your enterprise depends on the legacy construct, which is the Web2 world, then there's a bit of catching up to do, because blockchain either may not be relevant for you, or if you're in the business of providing trust, you are likely to be in danger. Got 10 minutes left. So as a final call to action, let's bring it all back to blockchain. Let's bring it back to the enterprise audience that's out here. For those of you who haven't begun this journey yet and who are asking yourself, should I be investing in blockchain? I'm not saying that you shouldn't. I'm not trying to draw a line saying there's only a purest few that you have to subscribe to. There's lots of interesting experiments out there. Lots of people are doing amazing work without mentioning names or platforms. And all of it is useful, right? All of this is fascinating effort. But then when somebody asks me, show me the use case, I always struggle, even though my day job is to sell blockchain to enterprises like many of you here. It's difficult because I don't think this is the way we should be asking about how blockchain should be employed. It's not about show me the use case. This is so new, there is no precedence for what we're building here. I mean, who thought 3 months ago that IEOs would be a thing, right? Or who thought you could tokenize CryptoKitties and crash the network because so many people were apparently interested in cartoonish collectibles. It's a very real thing. And it's not about the tech, it's about the people, it's about larger issues at hand. So when I'm asked to show the use case, I think there's a different way we should be approaching this. It's not about taking what we have, slapping a layer of blockchain on top of it and trying to say, look, we've done something amazing. I think the best use cases are yet to come. I truly believe that we haven't yet discovered a singular and holistic purpose for what blockchain can give us. There's lots of interesting aspects of blockchain that we can leverage, but the beauty of this tech is that unless we can solve for the trust issue, I don't think we really have the truest of use cases. So when is blockchain really effective, or what basic tenets should we consider? Now, I always like looking towards Bitcoin. I think the Bitcoin ecosystem is the unsung hero of the blockchain world. Think about it. It's the world's most anonymous, probably most decentralized network with 99.9% uptime, handling billions of dollars of real-world value that has yet to be hacked. That's a honeypot right there, waiting to be hacked. No one's broken into it, right? And it's proving that this technology can actually work. And it also solves for a very fundamental form of trust, the trust over money. Right? Expressing money and designing money is a very complex thing. It's not something that we've achieved very easily. It's evolved over the last many centuries, but that's exactly what Bitcoin's gone and disrupted. So if I were to take away 4 tenets that Bitcoin has afforded and sort of repurpose them for the enterprise audience, I think it would be quite relevant. The first is true ownership. If you can give your customer base real ownership and tell them that, look, this is actually yours. It's not something that's sitting on my server, and when it gets hacked, it suddenly isn't yours anymore. This truly is yours. That's probably the first most important feature. The reduced cost of trust is extremely important. If you're not passing on the reduced cost of trust to your customers, well, you probably don't need blockchain, right? If you can't help unlock new kinds of value, or if you can't cater to the bottom of the pyramid, and by bottom of the pyramid, I'm not trying to depict some sort of utopian idea that all we have to do is for, starving children in the third world. You could do something for the bottom of your pyramid. You could be an institutional player, and your peers, your fellow institutions could use blockchain. Peer-to-peer does not always have to mean individuals. It can also mean institutional. So do something for the bottom of your pyramid, make it possible for trust to percolate all the way down, make it possible for costs to really be shared, and then we're talking, right? Because the fact of the matter is, centralized constructs are still very useful. We're a long way from seeing the world completely be decentralized. I don't think that's ever going to happen. Most importantly, from an engineering perspective, we've spent the last 50 years shipping code with legacy tech. There's a reason why it works. Right? We have, 9 million Java developers all over the world? How many people can write Solidity? Right? So the truth is, if you don't need to fundamentally make a change on any of these tenets, you're probably better off with central technology. That said, what does it take to start building something on blockchain? I'm not trying to be prescriptive. I just want to share with you my perspectives on some good practices. There's many more that you'll hear over the next many hours. First of all, the essentials. Let's get this out of the way. And this is common, and this is agnostic to technology, right? If you're not thinking about the commercial side of your business, if you have no clear use case for your customers benefiting or for a real-world value implication, if you haven't thought through the compliance aspects of it, if you want to be the Wild West and think you can buck the trend and be something different, if you haven't got the engineering right, If there's no adoption model for you, if you haven't got the team or culture in place, your project is probably going to fail. And I want to say this because we're seeing again and again how projects with very interesting tech or fascinating adoption models or excellent teams often don't make it simply because all 6 cylinders haven't been fired on. So the essentials, if I were to distill what I've seen in the blockchain world, succeeding or failing, it comes down to these 6 factors. Get your commercials right, make sure that you're compliant, you're not just a liquidity provider of a new means, but also legitimate. Make sure that you have the right engineering. Adoption is extremely important. Lots of projects out there doing blockchain work, fascinating blockchain work, struggle. And they consider it being ahead of their time simply because the public isn't ready, right? And that shifts the narrative slightly. It makes it difficult to convince that blockchain is the solution. Also importantly, here's a simple ideation model. So for those of you who feel I've been a little too cryptic and high level, I'd like to leave you with this. When I think of blockchain, and when I advise clients for sizable amounts of money, I might add, I start by asking them 4 questions. Tell me about the trust construct in your system. Tell me about your network, about the data that you handle, and the fundamental economics. And I'll tell you whether you need, whether you have to start thinking about a blockchain use case or not. If you have a central trust custodian, and if that custodian is effective, why are you looking to decentralize? Why do you need trust to be shared? Is there a particular reason why something is wrong with the state of trust in your system? If you have a network with only 2 actors, and it's always going to be 2 actors, and it's not going to be an n-sided network, should you even be thinking about blockchain? Basic questions like these often help weed out use cases that don't work. Understanding what kind of data you host on your chain, because blockchain, as we know, isn't the best solution for hosting certain types of data. And what sort of ownership? Do your users need ownership of that data? Are they looking to you to provide ownership of that data? Are they convinced that you can own it for them? Also changes the course of whether we blockchainify or not. And finally, real world economics. Blockchain ultimately is about, there's a strong element of game theory. If there are no real market behaviors, if there's no incentive structure for people to participate in a network, right? And if it's a very simple system that does not require any kind of real world market behavior, you probably don't need blockchain. So think about those 4 factors, pass it through what is now being considered the scalability trilemma for blockchain. Is it decentralized? Can it scale? Is it sufficiently secure? That gives you an idea of whether you have to go public or private, and I'm sure we'll hear more about that later. Broadly speaking, it also tells you whether a consortium structure is better or whether you can do this solo, by yourself or your clients. And then finally, those 6 factors that I spoke about, and typically this is how we ideate. So if you do have to think about whether you need blockchain, at least think about the 4 factors, and most importantly, check for trust. I also want to propose that, with the evolution of trust and with the evolution of technology today, we also need an evolved mindset. More often than not, this is what I see keeping back strong ideas and strong projects. First of all, we've got to move away from this reductionist attitude, right? Taking something and reducing it to our limited perspective and not thinking about the bigger picture. We've been influenced by century upon century of ideas that this is how trust is supposed to work. We are convinced, and we were convinced at least, that the internet could only evolve so much and it couldn't be anything more. We've got to put on our 21st century glasses. We can't look at, especially on the legal and the compliance side, we can't judge this technology through the eyes of something that we've seen for the last 1,000 years. That's got to change. And more than anything else, cooperation, neutrality, and being open. After all, who are we to predict the future so early in the game, right? And we have been seriously wrong about this in the past, as we can see. We've consistently made predictions that have gone the wrong way. And this is not a knock on these people who said these things. I mean, they're amazing in their own right, and they built the future. But the fact is, it's extremely hard to predict where evolution is going to take us. And the important thing is to keep an open mind. So it's the 6th of June, 2019. Do you need a blockchain? The answer is probably not. But please watch this space. It's the most exciting thing ever, because the best is absolutely yet to come. Thank you very much for listening.